Nath, and I'm your host today. I'm co-hosting with Diane Mickelbank and the Senior Center, and we're very grateful that we've cooperated together over the years to provide this lecture series for you. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin at Whitewater, and this first page is just to give you some general guidelines for how the Zoom room sort of works. So I think that we don't have too many people, so we may be able to leave our video on, but sometimes if things get sketchy, it means that there's too many videos and microphones on and we're putting too much pressure on the system. So that's why we sometimes ask that you make sure you're muted unless you're talking, please, to at least reduce that bandwidth. And if it gets really bad, we'll also stop our video. So I want to just
Yeah, sure. It's one of these things that I feel like we've all just gotten accustomed to, right. Which is that inevitably technology will have some sort of issue, especially when you are depending on it. So hello, everybody. My name is Stephen Gerard. I'm an associate professor of chemistry at the University of Wisconsin at Whitewater. And looks like Lita has entered the waiting room. So maybe we'll just let her in now and let her give her intro.
Sorry about that. I guess I got bumped off. So I don't mean to interrupt. Go ahead, continue.
All right, so I think what I'll do is I'll just start, I'll share my screen and just go ahead and with my talk for today.
Alone.
It looks to me like this doesn't look quite right, but hopefully it appears okay for you guys. So hopefully you see this. Let me know if you don't. But here is the topic of our discussion for today. I'm an expert in the field of renewable energy, particularly on thermoelectric materials, which convert heat into electricity. But I'm also very interested in other forms of renewable energy, in particular battery technologies, as well as solar cells, solar photovoltaic technologies as well. And those are actually going to be the focus of our discussion for today. So I like to always start with a little outline so you know what you're getting into here. We're going to talk a little bit about the energy infrastructure that exists globally, also specific to the United States, and then more specifically to the state of Wisconsin. We're going to talk about things like the cost of energy, population growth, energy consumption, and then the renewable energy technologies that we hope are going to become a big part of our future energy infrastructure in Wisconsin and beyond. Let's start with a little pop quiz. I know that everybody is probably looking forward to being asked a question. Luckily, you don't have to respond to this one. I just want you to think about it. And I always ask this question of my general chemistry students when we get into this in class. And that is, I want you to think right now, how many cities in the United States have an urban population that is equal to or greater than 1 million people? I normally will open this up to questions in the class. Think about it, maybe a handful, maybe 5, not really sure. The answer to this is, as of the last census, and this is using data that at this point is maybe 7 years old, there are 10 US cities whose urban population is greater than 1 million people. 10 US cities. All right. Let's ask the same question then for China. How many cities in China have an urban population greater to or equal than 1 million people? This stage in the class, normally students will say maybe 20, maybe 30, 40. All right. Maybe some of you actually know this. It turns out there are more than 100 cities in China whose urban population is greater than 1 million people. What this means, all right, is that you have literally dozens and dozens and dozens of cities in China that are the same size as Chicago, LA, New York. In many cases, these huge cities are actually so big that they are many times the size of even the largest city that we have in the US, New York. All right, so for example, Beijing or Shanghai, and let's see if I can actually use my pen over here. So Beijing and Shanghai over here are estimated to have populations of 30 million people each. 30 million people, all right? As a frame of reference, New York City, which is the largest city in the US, has a population between 8 and 9 million, all right? So we're talking about urban populations that are somewhere between 3 and 4 times the size of New York, and there are multiple of these cities, all right? Now, the reason why I bring this up is because the scale of energy use and the scale of energy infrastructure is so immense globally that it's difficult to get your mind wrapped around it. And it's easy to think about how things exist in the US, but we also have to think about energy consumption and demand globally. We're going to address all of the energy needs of the world. So here I have some data. I actually got this data from the US Embassy in 2016 in China. I actually went to China. I spent a month there. And I find this very illuminating. What we have here are a series of pie charts. They're showing the percentage of each of the energy infrastructures as of 2015, comparing the sources of these. If you look at China, they are definitely going to be the largest consumer of energy worldwide. These units that we have here are metric tons of oil equivalent. US, though, is going to be the second most or second largest user of energy worldwide, right? Now, this can be a little bit shocking, right? Because the population of China is about 1.4 billion, or it was in 2015, which was about 18 to 19% of all of the people on Earth. The United States, we're using pretty close, the same amount, maybe 5–10% less energy than China, but we actually only comprise about 4% of the world population total. Now, if we look at another developing country, for example, India, the population of India, believe it or not, is actually catching up to China. And within probably the next 5 to 10 years, will surpass the population of China. They comprised in 2015 about 18% of the world population and use a considerably smaller amount of energy. But we can expect within the next 10 to 15 years, they will probably want to use more of that energy, just as China, just as the United States, just like a lot of these other countries as well. When we look at the types of energies that they are dependent on, largely in these more developing countries, they're going to be reliant on dirty sources of energy, particularly things like coal, right? So about 65% of the energy in China comes from coal, about 44% in India. As of 2015, it was about 20% by comparison in the US. The remaining sources of energy were coming from things like oil and then natural gas as well, right? I think it's important to note how we can project energy needs of the entire world as just a function of the population, right? So here we are, the United States. We are the third most populous country in the world, although we use on a per capita basis way more energy than everybody else. And then we have China and India, which have been increasing their energy demand considerably, and we can only expect for them to start to use more energy in the coming years as well. When we look at other countries that are also developing, places like Indonesia, Brazil, their energy demands are also likewise going to be increasing. All right, so the nature of energy infrastructure is a problem and a concern for all of us, because we need to think about how it is that we're going to be able to power the world, but then also consider our CO2 gas emissions. So this talk is not going to be focused too much on what happens with CO2 emissions. I hope you all agree with me that they are a concern, that they are man-made, and that they contribute to climate change. But when we actually look at the amount of CO2 that could potentially come out by virtue of the combustion of fossil fuels, it's really mind-boggling. So the United States and China are going to account for the vast majority of that. I think in totality, the US and China actually add up together to just under 50% of all of the CO2 that is emitted worldwide. But then you have some emerging countries as well, or regions that are also increasing the amount of CO2 they're pumping into the atmosphere. So if you look at this, you'll actually notice here that the United States, which is kind of teal color, has been pretty good at least maintaining the amount of CO2 over the past 25 years or so. There hasn't been a really considerable decrease. But then in these more developing countries, what we expect to see is a significant increase. For example, in China over here, other places in Asia as well, and then in particular India over here, which we expect to have a really, really very large increase in the amount of fossil fuel combustion and therefore CO2 emission. This is just a pie chart that shows the percentages as a function of the country. You'll note that the United States, even though we only comprise about 4% of everybody on Earth, we emit about 16% of all of the CO2. China emits about 30%, right? 30% of the CO2, even though they make up about 18% of the overall population. India over here is undoubtedly going to be increasing, as would the rest of the world, particularly if they are developing as well. So this is a global issue when we have to think about how to power the country or how to power the world, and then likewise how to do it in a way that is mindful and not going to mortgage our future generations with the issues of climate change and things. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start looking a little bit more at the U.S. energy infrastructure, to the generation and consumption of energy domestically here. What you'll note is that we have a plot shown over here. These are actually going to be both related here and here, where we have the year on the x-axis and then the percentage on the y-axis. Is how much of these energy sources comprise our overall energy infrastructure. And one thing you'll note is that over the last roughly 60 to 70 years, coal, which was once a really large portion of our energy infrastructure that had sort of a renaissance in the 2000s, has actually decreased considerably in the last 5 years in particular. If you look at the plot that we have over here, this is the production. You'll note that coal sort of has a little peak over here and then starts to really, really drop off at the same time that you have this massive increase in natural gas and then also crude oil and natural gas liquids as well. So this has actually been made into a pretty big deal politically, right? That the coal industry in the US has really been struggling. And therefore, people working in those industries have had issues losing their jobs. And, it's one of these very hot topics that a lot of people are very impassioned about and worry about. The reality is the reason why coal has actually fallen off is because other forms of fossil fuels, in particular natural gas over here, have simply taken its place. Coal is a relatively inefficient and fairly dirty form of energy. What this means is that for the piece of coal that you're burning, you don't get as much energy, and it also emits a lot of particulate matter, smog, as well as greenhouse gas when you compare it to something like natural gas. So what you'll note over here is that as natural gas, in particular, that fracking boom started taking hold in about the 2010s right here and here, then coal started to really drop off. And so, the issues that have surrounded the coal industry largely have come about because of the success of the natural gas and the fracking industry in the US. Now, we've also seen an increase in renewables. I will note over here that the renewables that it's shown in domestic production right here, they're a little bit higher than what we would expect normally. And what I mean by that is that the renewables are actually taking into account biofuels, things like ethanol that you would get from corn. You grow corn, for example, in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa. Those corn sources can then be turned into other types of fuels like methanol and ethanol. Those are going to be lumped into the renewables category. So in totality, renewables here look like they're about 10% or so of the overall consumption. But the topic for today, that is going to be mostly solar and then these other types of renewable energy, they only account for slightly around 5 to 10%, something like that, of the overall energy consumption in the US. One thing that I think is really important to note here, though, is this, all right? So when you just look in the last 3 years, that is going from 2017 until 2020, our solar energy consumption nationwide has doubled. Now, it didn't start from a very large place, but when you think about, say, in another 3 years, perhaps if it doubles again, we're then going from 1 to 2%, right? Maybe if it continues doubling every few years or even grows at a faster pace, the amount of energy that we're able to produce and therefore consume from solar becomes actually quite significant. And it could be pretty disruptive overall to the energy infrastructure of the US. I like to show plots like these as well. This looks kind of dicey if you aren't used to looking at these flow charts. What we have here is consumption flow chart. And on one side, we have all of the sources. So sometimes I could change the slide, but it looks like it's not there. So these are going to be all the sources of energy on the left-hand side. And then we have all of the places it goes on the right-hand side. And in particular, I'm going to draw your attention to that block right there, which is going to be where we kind of focus most of our energy in today's talk. That is going to be for electrical power generation, right? You have the lights on in your house. Where does that electricity actually come from? And largely in the US, that is going to be coming from a couple of sources. The first would be coal. You'll note over here, the coal block largely goes over here into electrical power generation. Most of that will actually go straight into that. Some of it will go into industry for the making of or manufacturing of products, but most of it just goes into electrical power generation. Natural gas is also used largely for electrical power generation over here. We also use natural gas today for heating as well, very, very common in this country. So when you see the natural gas going into residential, commercial, and industrial applications, most likely it is for heating applications. We also have other forms of electrical power generation, nuclear, hydro, wind, and then solar, which is just a small piece of the puzzle right now. But when we look at this, what we see is a lot of opportunity to be able to, say, replace or improve our energy infrastructure, moving away from natural gas and in particular. Specific to Wisconsin, so I actually hadn't looked into this very much before I started getting this talk together. If we look at the Wisconsin energy infrastructure, I was surprised to find out, maybe you already know this, but Wisconsin has absolutely no fossil fuel mines in it. All right, so by that I mean there are no mines in the state of Wisconsin to obtain coal, natural gas, or oil, at least none that are large enough to make a significant production quantity to actually be measured. So as it turns out, the energy that is produced in Wisconsin largely is going to be nuclear. We have nuclear power plants, and then we have those biofuels. Biofuels are going to be coming from corn primarily that is grown and then turned into ethanol or methanol. If you guys go to the gas station, see you can buy, for example, E85 fuel. Well, that tells you that a certain amount of the fuel is actually comprised of biofuel, ethanol, which is the same active ingredient that we have in wine and beer. But that can also likewise be burned and used as a fuel. Now, we still have to power plants with something, not just from nuclear or biofuel. So we actually import coal and natural gas from other states. Most of the energy that we produce in our state is actually going to be coming from natural gas, primarily for heating, and then coal primarily for electricity. So I'll also note here that we do have other forms of energy. So for example, in Monona or South Central Wisconsin, wind energy is one of these that you can probably see a lot. You know, driving on the highway, you see some large wind turbines, maybe a farm of them. As it turns out, wind in the state of Wisconsin only accounts for about 3% of the total electrical power generation in the state. So while it's something that you will see a lot of, it actually doesn't have a huge footprint overall. Now, I think it's important to ask, you know, where does Wisconsin lie in energy consumption compared to the rest of the U.S.? In other words, are we energy hogs? Do we use more than the average? So I looked this up. This is data from either 2016 or 2018. We are somewhere in the middle. And so the average is going to be somewhere around per capita about 300 million BTUs per state. It puts Wisconsin at 22 out of 50 of the states for sort of middling energy hogs. And when you look at the states that use the most energy, these are going to be states like Texas, states like Alaska, Louisiana. All right, so these are going to be states that will have a large amount of petroleum refineries, plants that utilize petroleum, also store them and then distribute them throughout the country, right? So the amount of energy is also going to come from transportation and industry. If you look at this plot over here, it actually show you, for example, all of the petroleum industries, in particular, places like Louisiana and say Texas are going to contribute to that significantly. In the Midwest here, so not necessarily Wisconsin, but over here in Iowa, Nebraska, Dakotas, these are going to be where we have the fracking, right? So this is where we have a lot of natural gas that is obtained in our country. Likewise, they're drilling for it, they're obtaining it, storing it, and then distributing it throughout the rest of the country and also exporting. And so when we look at the amount of energy that is consumed, it's literally the entire energy infrastructure in our country is based on fossil fuels. Now, I have a plot also here for the Wisconsin energy consumption. So I'll draw your attention once again to our electrical power generation box that we have over here. And what you'll note is that in comparison to our prior flow chart, you'll note here that the size of our whole block is considerably bigger than it is for the average state or I guess the entire country. That is to say, most of the electrical power generation in Wisconsin comes from coal. Most of the natural gas that we use in Wisconsin actually will go towards heating, which is going to be over here, going straight into residential, commercial, and industrial applications. When we look at petroleum, this is mostly oil. This is going to go for transportation, right? So these are going to be forms of energy that likely solar energy cannot address, right? So solar energy maybe could power or charge a battery that could be used to offset some of the transportation. Probably solar energy won't be used for heating. So natural gas certainly is going away. But when we think about an opportunity in the state of Wisconsin, replacing coal-fired power plants would be a fantastic thing to do. Now, as it is in Wisconsin, only a fraction of a percent of our electrical power generation actually comes from solar power. It's I think something like 0.3%. It shows up on our pie chart, but it shows up as 0% right now. And the hope is that this will change. I don't know if any of you have seen this lately. This headline. This is from the Wisconsin State Journal. There's an approved solar farm that's in Dane County here, and it's planned right now to provide about 40% of all of the electricity needed for Dane County. It's actually going to be built by MG&E, so Madison Gas and Electric. It's a 58-acre plot, county-owned land. It's right by the Madison Airport. And so the hope is that with more interest and desire from policymakers and from the public, that we might be able to see a little bit more investment into solar and cleaner forms of energy as well. You might be asking yourself, well, like, how is it that we got here? Well, the reason why anyone is interested in solar, it actually doesn't have everything to do with how you feel or your desire to do good on the world, even though I think that those should be really important things. The bottom line is always going to be money. It's always going to be money. So what is going to be the cheapest form of electricity, the cheapest form of energy that we can have and have robustly year in, year out? And so when we compare solar, so this is utility scale solar. So even more so than, say, just putting solar panels on your roof. We're talking solar farms. The cost of these has gone down considerably in the last 10 years and are now very competitive with other forms of fossil fuels, for example, coal and natural gas in particular. One of the limitations right now for a lot of renewable energy is that there exists in the legislature and our government, there exists a lot of subsidies for fossil fuels. And so right now, those don't necessarily exist for renewable forms of energy, but who knows, maybe they could exist. Maybe the cost will continue to go down. That's what we hope. And it'll continue to be competitive. One of the interesting considerations when we think about solar energy is that as you move north, all right, you just literally move farther north, because of the latitude change, you're going to have a different amount of sunlight per day, right? So you get more sunlight per day as you move closer to the equator. So the southern reaches of the US are going to just have more sun. And what that means is that it's more efficient for them. They get more sunlight, they get more potential solar power generation. In Wisconsin, because we're fairly north in the country, it's not as efficient as, say, a place in the Sun Belt, for example, Texas or New Mexico or Arizona. Likewise, there's also a consideration for temperature. As you have reduced temperatures, the ability for the electrons in these materials to move easily becomes more difficult. And so there's also issues with, like, snow. If you have snow covering your solar panel, it's not going to be able to get enough light. So there are actually a series of issues that come about geographically as well as from the weather. There has been a series of studies just looking at the overall amount of land that you would need to cover in the US to actually power the entire US. And it is estimated that you would need, if you just wanted to create one solar farm, a 10,000 square foot per square mile solar farm would do it. So this would actually, this little block right over here, if it were placed right there in Arizona, that would, in I think actually 2015 roughly efficiency, that would be enough to power the entire country. Just that one little block, if we just covered it completely with now, that's not feasible, right? That's actually a massive, massive plot of land. But hopefully you get the idea. If we take a series of these smaller solar installations and we're able to sprinkle them throughout the country, we're actually going to make a pretty big difference. And a lot of energy is simply hitting the the ground, it's coming into the atmosphere that is currently not being harvested. Another big consideration is the overall infrastructure with how to get power distributed, right? So how is it that if we have this little block, if we did that, how is it that we're going to get that power from Arizona all the way back to, right? And then this has to deal with our ability to actually have, high transmission wires, et cetera, things like that. So it's certainly going to be a shorter pathway to go from your roof than it is to go across the country. So we sort of want to have a happy medium between these power generation in an optimal place versus relying on the infrastructure itself. Now, solar installations have been increasing considerably in the last 10 years. You'll note here that for residential, which here is blue, non-residential, so those would be industries, and then also just for the utility scale, so this is generating power using these farms, considerably increasing in the installations. Wisconsin is somewhere in the middle. I was actually surprised to see that Minnesota is one of the leaders in the Midwest here. But what you'll note is that the grand majority of these are going to be in the southern part of the U.S., in that Sun Belt region as well. Likewise, there has been a solar industry job boom. Curiously, you're going to notice here that the amount of jobs really increases from about 2010 to 2016. You guys, probably have heard that there was a fairly large political event that happened in 2016 until 2020, right? That maybe has impacted the growth of solar in our country. But we've certainly had an increase in the number of jobs. And as of right now, there are actually more renewable energy jobs in the U.S. They haven't actually increased to the point of overtaking natural gas or other petrochemical jobs. So the solar growth is actually very impressive. I found this plot over here. This is a projection from a paper. This came out of the Energy Information Administration through the U.S. government. And they said in 2011, we hope to be able to go from here in the amount of solar, so that's this little yellow block. We hope to, by the time we get to 2035, have this size of solar energy production. And as it turns out, that was actually realized in the US in 2016. All right, so the projection from the US government that we hope to achieve in 2035 was actually achieved in 2016. All right, so almost 20 years early. Now the 2040 projection that they hoped to achieve 5 years after was actually achieved in the following year. All right, so this is a really good representation of the growth of the solar industry in the last 10 years. If you look year over year in the growth of the solar industry and the growth of the amount of energy that has been generated through solar, year over year, it's somewhere between 20 and about 60% in the last 5 years. You'll note in the last 3 years, it's fallen off. Now, it's only about 20% growth each year, but that is still a very, very large number. It's a very robust growth in the solar industry. And so it's viewed right now that solar is at a sort of a crossroads where it's hopefully going to start taking off, start to really compete in our energy infrastructure with fossil fuels. And the hope right now is, the future is now. We might think a little bit about what is actually causing the growth of the solar industry. And really, the bottom line is cost. If we look at the cost of solar cells over the last 30 to 40 years, they have fallen precipitously. This is largely because we have cheaper materials. We also have cheaper ways of making those materials. They have higher material efficiencies as well. So reliably, if you were to get a regular solar cell, you just go to, I don't know, go to Menards. If you can buy a solar cell at Menards, reliably, the efficiency of that is going to be between 10 and 20%, right? And this, once again, is going to depend on how you use it, your location. It's going to work more effectively if you live in Texas versus Wisconsin. What type of material is there? Some of these are going to be really nice. They have anti-reflective films. They allow for more of the visible spectrum to be absorbed. But generally speaking, this is what we're looking at. Something that is now very, very inexpensive compared to what we had before, and it works better as well. Let's talk a little bit about how these things actually work. All right, so when you look at a solar cell, here's a picture of a solar cell over here. Now you ask yourself, what's the color of this thing? And right, pretty much all of the time, whenever you look at a solar cell, there'll be sort of this blackish blue color. That's actually going to tell you something about what's happening to the light that's hitting those solar cells. All right, because these things are going to be blackish or bluish, this tells you that it's actually absorbing, sucking in visible light that hits it. If you look at something that is white in coloration, say a white wall, your screen right now, what the white color is telling you is that the incident light that comes in from your light bulb, it hits it and it just comes all the way back if it is white. Now, if it's black, the opposite is true. It's actually sucking in all of that energy from the light itself, absorbing it. So solar cells are effective in that they can absorb light that hits them. Once that light comes in, it then excites charge carriers. So these are going to be electrons and holes in the material themselves. All right. So you can actually see in this little bottom image over here, a little kind of GIF moving picture that shows you have lights come in. It actually excites electrons and holes in this material. These are the charge carriers. Then they actually are able to move through a load, through something like a motor, through a light bulb, charge a battery, and then they generate electric current. All right, so as long as you have that source of light, you're going to get electricity. You're going to have the flow of electricity in these materials. Now, fundamentally, the reason why these things work is because solar cells are going to be dependent on semiconducting materials. So what a semiconductor is that you have a semiconductor that behaves somewhere in between that of a metal and an insulator. And so what I'm showing here are some, these are energy structure diagrams. You can sort of think about them as like, where do I find the electrons in these materials? If you have a metal over here, the electrons in a metal are really easily movable. They can really slosh all over the place, right? And that's good if we have a metal. We want that. If we have a metal, we use it in wiring, right? We want electrons to be able to flow through that thing really effectively. It's also a reason why for a lot of metals, they conduct heat really well in the same way. Heat can just move through, say, that metal pan really effectively. You take a piece of glass or something and you put that on top of your stove, it's not going to heat as effectively, right? So metals, because they have all of these electrons, they can move around really easily. It's actually not the best at absorbing light. They absorb that light, but then re-emit it, not very effective. On the flip side, if we have something like an insulator, this is like a chunk of glass. Say if you have a teacup, this would also be an example of an insulator. Now, these things really don't like to absorb light at all. The reason is because there's a huge difference in that jump, right? So if you want to have electrons absorb light, they got to jump somewhere. Well, if there's such a huge difference in energy in that jump, then it's just not going to do it. It's just not going to absorb that light at all. So a semiconductor is somewhere in between. These are the materials that we are mostly interested in using for solar applications, a lot of other applications as well, in that they have a gap that exists where you find the electrons and where you don't find the electrons, but it could jump. Basically what you have is you have some light come in, hits this thing. The electrons that exist in this sort of filled band will actually jump across that gap. They become a little bit untethered. They can start to move around more easily. And because of that, then it will actually lend itself to producing an electric current when you just shine light on this thing. You have a lot of chemical control when you make these things. So as a chemist, it's very interesting and exciting to work. So what most solar cells are going to be made of are going to be silicon. All right, so silicon is actually an extremely abundant material. It is, believe it or not, the second most abundant atom in the crust of the Earth. So odds are good if you go outside and you pick up a rock, you pick up a stone, and certainly sand, all of these things are going to be comprised mostly of silicon. So the way that we make silicon in the lab has actually gotten a lot better. And if you can make it cheaper, then you actually increase the overall, you don't increase the efficiency, but you decrease the cost of the solar cell itself. I'll also note here that worldwide, China is far and away the #1 manufacturer of silicon in the entire world. Now, in my lab at Whitewater, I'm interested in coming up with new creative ways of making silicon for solar cells and other applications. So in my lab, and I probably don't have enough time to talk about this, but in my lab, I have developed new ways of being able to essentially start with something like sand. You just take sand. I actually found ways of taking that material, a sand-like material, dissolving it into a liquid salt, doing reactions with it at a high temperature, but not as high as what you would normally expect. Normally, you would need a super high temperature, about 1700 to melt that stuff. In my lab, we do it about 1,000 degrees lower. And we can do it in such a way that we generate nanoparticles of these materials. So I'm a nanochemist, so I always like showing pretty pictures of the materials that we make in the lab. And so by doing this, we can actually have some liquid phase chemistry that occurs. That means that we can actually precipitate crystals of these things. The crystals themselves look very pretty. At least I think that they look very pretty. As a frame of reference here, the size of these things are incredibly small, which is part of the reason why this is interesting. You'll note that the little scale bar that we have over here tells you what the size is. And then from one side to the other, we have, for example, nm. So an nm means a nanometer, and a nanometer is going to be the equivalent of 1/1 billion meters. All right, so that is to say, if you started with a meter stick, which is pretty darn close to a yardstick, you take that thing, you chop it up into 1 billion pieces, then that would be 1 nanometer. These particles are so small that they can actually easily diffuse in and out of cell membranes. Their properties in many cases are going to be completely different from the quantum physics, and they're very interesting. But fundamentally, as chemists, we're also interested in being able to create these structures at a very small scale so that we can control them, but also make very nice small devices as well. So similarly, we've also been able to make nanowires of these silicon materials, and these would all be materials that potentially could be used in solar applications. There are going to be a lot of other materials that are of interest for solar applications. But mostly all of the other materials have some fundamental issues with them. So some of these that are really also interesting are going to be things like gallium arsenide or cadmium telluride. The problem with these is that they are comprised of expensive elements. These are going to be elements that are largely, in some cases, as rare as gold, or they're going to be comprised of things that are toxic, right? For example, cadmium is toxic. It's a toxic metal. And then this GaAs is arsenic, right? So that's found in rat poison. So these are going to have some fundamental issues potentially with them. There are other types of solar cells that exist. For example, dye-sensitized or organic. These are relatively cheap, but they're very difficult, if not impossible, to scale up. I remember when I was in grad school 15 years ago, this was a huge hot topic of focus. in the research, and it's like they have never really done anything commercially. And so that sort of speaks to how difficult, if not impossible, it is to make. So perovskite solar cells are new. These are very exciting. These have emerged in the last 5 years. These are really cool because you can make them super, super easily. Literally just mix some stuff together, and then you just kind of drop it on a surface and let it dry. It's really, really easy to make. But the main issue with these perovskites is that they comprise themselves of lead, and that they're also water soluble, which is an issue. If you have a solar cell on top of your house, and say if it gets a crack in it, right, it's gonna rain, it's gonna snow. You don't want water to get into that thing, dissolve lead. Now that lead is just coming off of your house. So what you'll see is that all of the solar materials that exist right now, they all have positives, they all have negatives. And probably right now, the industry leader is gonna be something made of silicon. In this huge plot, we actually have all of the different kinds of solar cells that exist. Most of the ones that are in purple up here are going to be those gallium arsenide ones that have really awesome efficiencies. They're hard to make. They're also pretty expensive and toxic. What we have in the middle here are blue. These are going to be the silicon ones that I focused on mostly today. Perovskite is going to be right below it. What you'll note is that the state of art of a lot of these is somewhere between 20 and 25% efficient, which is actually awesome. That's really, really very good. What that means is that if you think about taking a light bulb and hitting that solar cell, about a quarter of all of the particles of light that hit it are then going to actually generate electricity. That's really very good. And currently the world record is 47%, and this was published in the last year. 47%, that's actually really, really remarkable. That's almost half of all of those photons hitting that get converted into electricity. The way that they do the way that they get this remarkable efficiency is actually they create what is known as a multi-junction cell. So this is like it's sort of like a stack, like a sandwich. When you look at sunlight overall, it's going to have a pretty wide spectrum, and the visible spectrum is actually only between about here and about here. All right, that's about 400 nanometers up to about 700. Now, there's also other forms of light that come from the sun. We got UV. Right, the UV for me in particular gives me sunburns in the middle of the summer. But there's also a lot of heat, IR radiation that comes from this. So what has been found is that you can actually stack materials one on top of the other so that it harvests all of the available wavelengths of light that come from the sun. And if you do this and you're able to engineer this thing appropriately, you can actually get these super high efficiencies that are pushing up to like 50%, which is really very exciting. Even past that, right, all of the heat that is generated from say the sun itself can also be used, right? So this is what I have my PhD in, which is thermoelectric technology. This is converting heat into electricity. Essentially, what you could have is a large concentrator, a bunch of these mirrors that then take all of the sunlight for some area and then condense it right onto a central point. And if you then take that central point, you convert the visible light to electricity using your solar cell, then you could similarly take the heat and convert that into electricity using a thermoelectric device. And I don't have enough time to talk about that right now, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Now, it's one thing to generate the electricity, but the sun doesn't shine all day. It doesn't shine 40 or 24 hours a day, right? So you have to have some way of capturing that energy when it's generated and then storing it and using it later. So I think most of us have a familiarity now with lithium ion batteries. This is also a tremendous technology. So I just note a little bit the history here is that the first lithium ion battery was lab tested in 1985, commercialized in 91, and then the Nobel Prize in 2019 in chemistry was won by John Goodenough, Whittingham, and Ticino for lithium ion batteries. These are high energy density. They're extremely robust. You can use them for thousands of cycles before they need to be repaired or replaced. And they also don't self-discharge. What that means is that you can have a battery, you can put it on a shelf for a really long time, and it doesn't just like break down by itself. A little bit of how these lithium ion batteries work is that you have essentially three parts to your battery. You've got a cathode that contains a metal oxide that also has lithium in it. So lithium is sort of the active atomic ingredient. You have the middle zone, which is known as an electrolyte. That's going to only allow lithium to move through it. And then at the anode, you then have something else. Right now, it's typically going to be graphite. And then we're also interested in using materials like silicon, which can actually be even more efficient. So when you charge or discharge this thing, what you'll note is that the lithium ions are just going to go back and forth across your battery itself. They move from one side when you discharge them. And then when you recharge that material, then they move to the other side. And this process of going back and forth is going to be the cycling of this. And one of the great triumphs of lithium ion batteries is this thing doesn't break. It doesn't fall apart, right? You can use one of these lithium ion batteries and you can basically fully charge and discharge this thing for thousands of times. If you have a cell phone, right, you probably charge this thing every single day. You can do this and for years and years and it will still function. Likewise, you may have heard of like Tesla technologies, which are kind of hot right now. One of their parts of their business is actually building batteries that have even more capacity. So this energy density plot that I show over here sort of shows you right now most smartphones are going to be somewhere in this range. Hybrid cars right now, on average, are a little bit higher, and Tesla has been sort of sequentially pushing the limit, somewhere in the order of maybe 20% more efficient, which is why you can say they 5 years ago only have a range of maybe 50 miles with an electric car. Now it's 200, something like this. I'm interested in doing this. I've done some research using silicon nanowires made in my lab, looking at these in batteries as well. But in the interest of time, I think I might just end it there because I see that we're getting pretty close to 11. So I'm also, I'm pretty close to the end of my talk. So I think I'll just end it there. Hopefully you'll agree with me. The future is now. I'd like to thank the Monona Senior Center for the opportunity to talk to you guys today and for you and your attention. And I'll take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Stephen. Very, very informative. Anybody have any questions? Just pay attention to unmuting yourself first. I have a question for you about your lab and the work that you're doing.
Sure.
You taught us today about what a nanometer is, and I'm just wondering, how do you not lose your materials? They're so tiny. So can you just talk a little bit about what it's like working with nanoparticles and the tools that you need?
Yeah. That? So the particles that I'm making are super small. And so this is a slide that I have that I presented at some conferences. It's got a whole bunch of data on here. And if you're not used to looking at this, it makes a lot of sense. That, whoa, what is it that we're looking at? And I'll direct your attention to this little picture up here. So that's an actual picture of a vial of nanoparticles that I've created in my lab, and my students have created in my lab, of some of these silicon-containing nanoparticles. So when we do the reaction, it generates literally trillions on trillions of these nanoparticles that are incredibly small size. But there's so many of them that they kind of clump together. We say that they agglomerate, and they clump together, and then you can handle them. You can put them in vials and you can do stuff with them. So for us, we're interested in taking then large quantities of those particles that we then can handle at a human scale, and then pressing them into pellets or putting them into stuff and looking at the effect. So the particles themselves are quite small, but when you have so many of them, you can still handle them. So, so yeah, one other thing I'll note here that I think is kind of cool is that if you look at this picture of this nanoparticle, you'll note that it has stripes. Same thing with this one over here. So the stripes that you see on this particle are coming about because the way that the particle is oriented, it's like you're looking straight down planes of atoms that are generated from the crystal itself. All right, so this is sort of like if you're driving on the highway and you look out at a cornfield. From one orientation, it just looks like a mess. And then all of a sudden, you'll see down one of the planes of all of the corn. It's nicely stacked up. So that's what we're seeing in this picture right here.
So do they naturally orient themselves like that? And is that what you're saying?
Yes. So the crystal itself is going to be comprised of planes of atoms that actually will naturally stack up in this kind of arrangement. And if you take your crystal and you kind of orient it just so, and you look at it from a certain way, then you'll actually see those. I like to just point this out because what you're looking at here literally are individual atoms. So that's how small these particles. They can just be planes of atoms themselves.
Thank you. Stan, turn on your microphone if you have a question. I see you're trying to ask something.
Why do they explode in the airplane?
So I think what you're asking is why is it that a lithium ion battery might explode in an airplane?
Yes.
Yes. So if any of you have gone on traveling on an airplane, what they always tell you is take your battery out of your pack, out of your luggage, right? Don't have it just sitting in your luggage. We don't want to put that into the cargo hold because we're worried that it could explode. Now, the reason why lithium ion batteries are potentially dangerous and lend themselves to exploding is because inside of them, you have lithium. Now, lithium is an extremely useful metal. It's a metal that allows the battery to function, but it's going to work only if it's sealed inside of the battery casing. So the worry is that if you have, say, your computer, your smartphone, even just a rechargeable lithium battery, and you put that into the cargo, it could get damaged. Maybe another package or a piece of cargo falls on it and damages it. And if that's the case, then the battery casing could actually become compromised. And the fear is then that oxygen, the oxygen that you're breathing right now that just exists in the air, is going to get into the battery. Now, that's a big problem because if oxygen gets into the lithium itself, this has the tendency to release a large amount of energy. It releases so much energy that it can actually explode. It can actually generate hydrogen gas, and then that hydrogen gas becomes very, very hot, and it then can cause an explosion. So if you've ever seen some of these images of a burning laptop or something like that, it's likely because the lithium ion battery has been compromised. Actually, the casing has been broken. And so provided that you don't do that, then it should be good, right? And it's a similar sort of thing. If you have a lead acid battery, like what you have in your car, something like that, we don't want that to become compromised either. If it breaks, then it will leak battery acid, and that's also bad. So, but they don't explode. So,
thank you.
You're welcome. That's a good question.
I I have another question for you, and then I think we'll probably ask for one more and then wrap it up. So if anyone has a question, start thinking about it. But you talked about the solar farm in Dane County that's going to provide energy for, or about 40% of the energy, I think you said, for Dane County.
For the county, yeah.
And do you know the plans for that? Like, when will that energy farm be active and actually providing 40% of our energy?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to it.
Oh, okay.
I would have to look into the actual article and dig in a little bit. I think it's just been approved, so right? So in the last couple of months. My guess is that it should probably take at least a year to for the plans to be finalized. They also have to get the plot of land squared away, and then they have to actually build them. One of the considerations with a solar farm is also whether or not the solar panels will track the sun. Most of them are going to track the sun because the sun is going to move across, the sky. You want to actually have your solar panel oriented perfectly so that it then tracks the sun and absorb most of the light. So little parts of the function also are going to add complexity and potentially make it take a little bit longer to set up, but are ultimately going to be worth the cost because then you get more benefit from it.
Thank you. Are there any other questions out there?
Stephen, very good talk, very good presentation. As you know, solar can't generate at night.
Yes.
So when are utilities considering installing these remote batteries, distributed batteries throughout their areas? And I know talk at one time was regarding using batteries from cars to generate at night, from the inverter. Any thoughts on that?
Right. So this is actually one of the biggest issues. So that you mentioned. So this is a really good question, which is that you generate a bunch of electricity during the day. The sun goes down. Now you don't generate any more electricity. So you have to store it somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. And it would be awesome if we could just make a giant battery, just like a huge building that is a battery. In practice, it's basically impossible to do. If you think about any of the batteries that you guys have on your computer right in front of you, if you're using a laptop or your cell phone, these things are not very big, are they? They work great for a personal device, but for grid level storage, that's actually a huge problem that hasn't been addressed yet. There's the prospect of, maybe we can generate this by taking a series of these batteries and putting them together. That's essentially what Tesla has done. If you have read up on their sort of home storage batteries that you can actually buy, or maybe potentially buy in the next few years, which is a battery that can be used for all of the devices in your house. But when you're thinking about the scale of energy of the entire country, it's massive. So there are some other exciting technologies, including metal liquid batteries, which use liquid metals themselves to actually store energy. When I was putting together this talk, I thought, well, if you guys have me back, I need to just give a talk on batteries, because there's so much about battery technology that is new and exciting that could be used in the future and address exactly that question. So this is something that hasn't been figured out yet. Most of the energy storage is at a very small scale, very local scale. And hopefully in the future, the next 5 or 10 years, we'll figure out some good solution for a large scale energy storage.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I want to tell you good job again, and we really appreciate that you came to speak with us today.
Thank you.
I'd also like to remind the guests today that Diane will be sending you an email today or tomorrow or Monday with a link to click on. It has 5 short questions to evaluate today's speaker. And just thank the Friends of the Monona Senior Center again, and we'll call it a day. So thank you again, Stephen. I'll see you in the spring because we're not on campus anymore, but best wishes.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye-bye.